Before you've read a single word on a website or a product on a shelf, you've already decided whether you trust it. In about 7 seconds, just from how it looks. My guest today has spent more than 25 years thinking about why and about how the smartest brands earn our trust and keep it. She is a brand and content strategist, the founder of the Boston consultancy Appropriate Inc., and the author of Trustworthy: How the Smartest Brands Beat Cynicism and Bridge the Trust Gap. She boils it down to 3 words: voice, volume, and vulnerability. Speaking consistently, sharing the right amount, and having the nerve to admit when you've got something wrong. We talk about why healthy skepticism is good for us, why giving people more control can win their trust, why saying less can say more, and the one thing any organization could change on Monday morning to become more trustworthy. Margot, welcome to TrustTalk. You are a content strategist, right?
That is correct. Yeah, I've been working as a content strategist for a little over 25 years.
So what sparked your interest in trust? Where did it come from?
Well, I think over the past probably 10, 15 years, certainly in US politics and in global politics, we've seen how the landscape has really shifted around how organizations and governments and politicians build and accrue and then can lean on assumptions of trust. And for me, it really started probably about 10, 15 years ago when I was seeing how things were shifting in the political landscape here in the States, where it used to be that if you'd catch a politician in a lie, it would completely scuttle their campaign. And that was not happening so much. I think certainly we could see in like the rise of Donald Trump, where things were shifting and he, as well as other politicians, were starting to play fast and loose with the truth, where they might be caught in a lie and maybe media would initially jump on it. Maybe they wouldn't. But ultimately, it didn't seem like it always mattered to their constituents and to the audiences that they were hoping to build. And people didn't always turn away from them when they were caught in those lies. And largely, at the time at least, as a consultant, as a content strategist, I wasn't working with a lot of clients in that political sphere. At the time, I wasn't working with any NGOs or governmental institutions either. So I wondered, for the organizations that I do work with in retail and higher ed and other industries, did this matter? Would it affect them as well? And it turns out it did matter, and it very much pervades all industries.
These days, a lot of us just assume the worst, that every brand is spinning us, that the reviews are fake, that nobody's really telling us the truth. That blanket distrust is the cynicism your book takes on. Can you paint a picture of what it looks like in everyday life? And where is the line between that and the healthy doubt we all need?
I think it's an important question to ask because it gets at the heart in many ways of what it means to be a smart, savvy, worldly human and consumer, as well as voter and just participant in our society. And I think it's really the difference, and it's an important distinction between cynicism and skepticism, because we talk about a healthy skepticism. We use that when we say, well, I'm not going to just take things on face value. Just because an ad is telling me that something's going to get my shirts whiter and brighter, or because a certain exercise platform is going to meet all of my hopes and dreams and needs, I'm not going to just believe it right on face value, right? And I think that sort of skepticism of saying, well, hold on a sec. Let me check with my existing knowledge, what I already know about this industry, about this organization. Let me go on like what I've heard from friends. Maybe let me think back about news reports that I've heard about this brand as well. That kind of practice invites us to check in with the fact that for any of us, it's not our first day on this planet. We've been around the block. We've maybe learned a thing or two in that time. Granted, with experience does not always come wisdom, but I think for many of us, we try to think, all right, I know how to move through society. I know how to move through the world with a certain degree of healthy skepticism to say, I'm not going to just believe everything that I hear. I'm not going to believe everything that I read. I'm not going to believe everything that I think. I need to kind of check that as well.
In your book, you say something that surprises a lot of business people. If you want customers to trust you, give them more control, not less. Hand them the full information, let them compare, even tell them when your product isn't right for them. Can you explain what you mean by that and why letting go like that actually builds trust?
So I would say it isn't necessarily about giving them the full information, but about giving them enough information so that they can make good decisions and feel good about the decisions that they've made to reduce that sense of regret. And I think walking that line, that's something that I think I first started thinking about probably in the early days of blogging. I remember hearing a lifestyle blogger on a panel at South by Southwest in Austin. She was talking about oversharing, and she was like, well, let's be clear. You trust me. No one questions me. They don't question what I don't share based on the volume that I do share. In other words, she was saying, I'm not divulging every aspect of my life, but I'm sharing enough that you feel like you have a good sense of who I am, how I make decisions, so that when I recommend a product, you feel like, all right, you can go on that recommendation. I think that translates really well to brands too, when they're determining how much to share, because if they base it just on maybe sharing final results of a study or saying 9 out of 10 dentists agree this is the best toothpaste out there, we've come to treat that with a degree of doubt. But by exposing the data behind the process, maybe by sharing the steps in a clinical trial or sharing how they tested different products before making a recommendation or even recommending their own, it gives people a sense of, oh, well, I could reproduce this kind of trial if I wanted to. Or, well, I can see that they evaluated a wide array of products in the field. So I feel like I can trust the recommendation that I'm getting. And I think that way of giving them access to the information behind the recommendation, that gives people a sense that they can trust it, even if they choose not to reproduce that study or that trial in the same way.
Can you give an example of a brand that teaches instead of just selling?
One that I go back to again and again is America's Test Kitchen. So it's a publishing platform, America's Test Kitchen. They publish more than a dozen cookbooks every year. There's also a few different magazines that they publish, Cooks Illustrated, Cooks Country. They have a number of television shows as well, I believe, that stream there too. And they're known for providing a wealth of research behind all of their recommendations. So when they endorse maybe a particular line of pots and pans or a particular series of knives or maybe a particular set of spices, they're doing so typically based on information like, we checked out 20 others within this category. Here's how they stacked up. These are the different tests that we ran with them. Here's how we kind of put them through their paces. And in doing so, they're building trust and credibility. They're known for their deep research. And they're known for also being able to say when they've gotten something wrong. So in addition to kind of making those recommendations, frequently they will revisit them across their publishing and say, 5 years ago, we recommended maybe this particular knife block or this particular line of cookware. However, something new is out on the market, or we've noticed that they've changed their metal composition. Here's how we're changing our recommendations now.
In the book, you boil trust down to 3 words: voice, volume, and vulnerability. Can you take us through each one?
Sure. Well, I think vulnerability is actually what I was just touching on, that ability to say, we got that wrong, or here's how we're still trying to work through a problem. And I think that ability of saying, like, we don't know, but here's how we're going through a process to maybe improve our company, or we were caught in this maybe production problem, or we've been having supply issues. Here's how we're letting down our customers, but here's what we're going to do about it. That ability to say, we don't have all the answers yet, but here's how you can hold us accountable is incredibly powerful. That's something that Zoom did really well. If we think back to like the early days of the coronavirus pandemic, when so many meetings were moving to Zoom, so many people were no longer meeting in an office where they might have an IT department saying like, hey, you need to maybe set security protocols for that meeting, maybe password protect it. Zoom had a real problem with people coming into meetings, kind of the rise of the Zoom bombers. And their platform was kind of crumbling under the weight of that. And rather than saying people are using this wrong, they're not setting security measures the way they should, their CEO wrote an open blog post to the community that said, here's how our platform is not meeting our needs and your needs right now. And for that, we are deeply sorry. He apologized in the first person, not hiding it in passive voice. And then he said, here's what we're going to do about it. We're going to submit to third-party monitoring. We're shifting all of our engineering resources to focus on security and privacy issues. Here's how you can hold us accountable. And I think that's a wonderful testament to building trust by being vulnerable. And then as far as volume and voice, I think there are two sides of the same coin. By voice, I mean how a brand is able to build a voice consistently, how to speak and offer content, as well as verbal and visual design in a way that is consistent with the brand's message architecture or communication goals, as well as across all platforms. So people always know the organization with which they're engaging. And then volume refers to the length and level of detail that that brand is offering. As we were talking about with kind of showing your work and sharing research, giving people enough information so that they feel like they can make good decisions based on it. That's what I mean by the volume of information they share.
In your book, you also dig into how a brand like Airbnb earned the trust, and you have advised big names like Timberland and Harvard yourself. Does a well-loved consumer brand build trust differently than let's say, a bank or a public institution?
I am smiling hearing that because two of the organizations that I've been working with extensively over the past year are actually, one is a large bank here in the US, banking institution here in the US, and the other is a branch of government. And I would say, no, I think whether you are a consumer facing B2C organization or one that doesn't necessarily think of yourself as a traditional business, I think across that spectrum, in all cases, an organization needs to speak in a consistent voice, verbally and visually, so that your audience knows who you are, knows how you are, and what they should remember about you. So that when they hear from you, whether it's in a letter about maybe taxes or healthcare or financial services, or just new products that you have on sale this week, they know who they're hearing from. And I think still across that entire spectrum, we need to give people information that they can use and be willing to admit when things are changing or when there's been an organizational misstep, when maybe the CEO has done something stupid or where you need to maybe pull back on a particular product. I think in all of those cases where there's an opportunity to build trust through vulnerability across industries, I've seen how that can only help.
One of the other three requirements, if you like, for trust you mentioned is volume. Volume is an interesting one. You say that something saying less builds more trust. When should a brand turn the volume down?
That can be challenging, I think, especially for organizations that are used to that or have gotten good at reaching out to their audience and pulling them close. But I think that there can be a good opportunity to build trust sometimes by sitting back and listening and making your audience aware that now is not the time for us to be kind of filling the zone with noise, but we want to hear more from you. One of the examples that I share in Trustworthy comes from TED, the platform that so many of us love to see new videos and to kind of hear what the world's thinkers are sharing on different topics. Several years ago, they were going through a problem that was undercutting the value of their brand, the value of those videos, where some kind of spurious content was rising to the top across a few different industries. They were seeing it a lot in some of their hard science videos, where information that was popular because it was well ranked in the algorithm, because it was coming to the top of the algorithm a lot, was not necessarily correct. It was either science that had been debunked and had never had broader support within the community, but it sounded really good. Or they were videos that maybe shared beliefs, shared kind of working theory that through further testing had been disproven, which is the nature of how science evolves. To many untrained people, that can feel wrong and scary and maybe shaky. Within the science community, though, they saw it as a bigger problem that content was still very popular across those videos that was not correct. Therefore, the platform itself should not have been sharing it, or so they thought. TED's approach to that was to curate a forum where they brought some of their loudest, most vociferous critics in to say, you're right. We need to have a way to maybe reorganize content. Should we be delisting it if it's no longer correct or if it's been proven incorrect? What do you recommend? So they pulled their critics closer and then let them talk and sat back and listened and learned from it. And in doing so, that built rapport with their audience, who was able to share more freely and also built a lot of goodwill. Some of their harshest critics became some of their loudest champions then after they implemented ideas like adding tags to videos that were no longer the most recent or well-respected on a particular topic. In some cases, they added community notes as well. And in doing so, that allowed their critics and their audiences to speak up while they could just sit back and listen.
When a company tries too hard to reassure people in a crisis, for example, or when something's gone wrong, why does all that reassurance so often backfire and leave people trusting them less?
I think it comes down to tone. I think in many industries, we like to speak from a point of certainty. And vulnerability has for so long been seen as dangerous and a weakness. I think you recently spoke with Catherine McComas on the idea that greatest trust in science does not necessarily come from always being right, but being able to share more of the doubt and all along the way. And I think when I say it comes down to tone, it's because so many companies, when they are trying to reassure people, they fall on phrasing that in our personal lives we know doesn't work. Things like, trust us, calm down, without necessarily giving people reasons to trust them. I think that reassurance works best when it first comes from a point of empathy, of acknowledging what people are feeling, being able to say, we understand you are really frustrated. We are too. I mean, that's what Zoom had done so well in that blog post. And then being able to say, not just calm down and trust us, we've got this, when clearly we didn't, but in saying, here's what we're going to do about it. And I think when we take apart the language further, many organizations still make the cardinal mistake in apology of not taking responsibility. They offer apology without accountability. And maybe they hide it in passive voice. Maybe they don't immediately take ownership. Maybe they mire it in weasel words that don't actually acknowledge what happened and what we will do about it moving forward so it does not happen again. Those are basics of good apologies that, we teach to children. We can certainly teach it to marketing departments as well.
When you land on a website or pick up a product in a shop, you often get a feeling about whether you can trust it before you've even read a single word, just from how it looks. What is it in the design that sends that signal?
It's an interesting challenge because I think so much about the design that sends that signal to trust it is based not necessarily on things that come from the brand and from the organization, but so much that comes from the viewer and the lived experiences that they're bringing to that product. I was recently reading about this where the designer was making the point that in those first 7 seconds, I think he said, of experience with a product, maybe picking it up off the shelf, the user doesn't know anything about it. The potential consumer doesn't necessarily know anything about it. So they are basing their initial response and deciding to trust it just on the visceral reaction, maybe to the typeface, the connotation that already comes with that particular color scheme, based on experiences that they've already had with maybe other products in that array or other products from that brand. And that idea that we can't control everything, so let's lean on things that maybe are already familiar to the potential customer, it's a powerful idea that I think goes back to an earlier core principle in design that things need to look like what they are. It kind of butts up against that idea of the Maya principle of make things most advanced yet acceptable. If something looks too far out there, whether it's a chair or a car or a bottle of shampoo, somebody's not going to know how to understand it, how to interact with it, and if it makes sense for them, if it'll fit into their existing lives. And I think we need to start from that idea on websites with product design, in service design, that first need the objects and experiences need to meet those basic kind of core principles of looking like what they are, looking accessible and being accessible so that someone knows how to interact with it. Then they can move forward and learn about it, see what other content it has to offer, and decide if they should move forward in trusting it.
Margot, companies keep rolling out new technology that can unsettle customers. Stores using facial recognition, say, or apps that track a lot of your data. How should a brand bring in something like that without losing people's trust?
This is where we bump into everything from flock and other camera level surveillance to content around GDPR there. And I think the best thing that companies can do when they're rolling out new technology is by communicating it to their customers upfront in a way that is clear and concrete and accessible, giving people control about being able to turn off that technology if they don't want to have that monitoring or being able to avoid it in kind of a real world experience so that consumers understand why a company is using particular technology, what they're going to get out of it, what that consumer is going to get out of it by maybe having a more personalized experience and what that actually means, what that trade-off is, and then how they can opt out of it. I think if we want to embrace new technology, we also have to embrace new ways of giving people control over privacy, security, and what they share.
If a listener of our podcast runs a small organization and can only change one thing on Monday morning to become more trustworthy, what should it be?
When we were talking about voice, volume, and vulnerability, I think we talked about them in the reverse order, but I would say first and foremost, in a small business, in a large business, take a look at your voice. Look at if you're communicating consistently across all platforms, across all professional communicators, all the different people that contribute to representing your brand, and establish standards for that. If you don't have a message architecture or a hierarchy of communication goals, work to establish that. It's a small thing that pays off enormous dividends. And then develop editorial style guidelines. They don't have to be complex. They don't have to be expensive to create, but develop guidelines that say, this is how we always communicate. Our voice is consistent, even if we vary the tone. This is who we are and how we are. And here's how we communicate verbally. And then also here's how we communicate visually. I think establishing that consistent platform that's the number one thing every organization needs to do.
Margot, thank you. In a world that is quick to tell us who not to trust, you do the harder thing. You show organizations how to earn it, one honest choice at a time. The right voice, the courage to say less, and the nerve to be a little vulnerable. Margot, thank you for being our guest at TrustTalk.
Thank you so much. This was a lot of fun.
Thank you for listening to TrustTalk. Trust is easy to praise, much harder to understand. That's what these conversations are for. Hope to see you back for the next conversation.